Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hewitt Shaw, the president of the board of directors of the City Club. The City Club is proud of the timeliness of its speakers and topics that we bring to this forum every week. We may have outdone ourselves this afternoon. The importance of free speech and protected speech in our American society is at the front of the daily news as the FoxNews.com reporter Jana Winter faces legal action, including possible incarceration, for refusing to reveal her sources behind her exclusive story revealing the existence of a notebook that accused mass murderer James Holmes in last year's Colorado mass movie theater massacre, reportedly sent to his psychiatrist days before the massacre. Holmes' attorneys claim these sources violated the judge's gag order in the case, possibly depriving the accused of a fair trial. The reporter claims protection of her sources under the media's privilege of confidentiality under Colorado's Shield Law. We are fortunate and honored to have at our podium today James C. Goodale, an author and one of the country's leading First Amendment lawyers, to speak with us about the importance of freedom of the press, focusing on media issues ranging from the Pentagon Papers to WikiLeaks. Mr. Goodale has served as vice chairman and general counsel of the New York Times and is a partner at the large New York-based law firm Debevoise & Plimpton. In June of 1971, when the New York Times published the first of the Pentagon Papers, a series of top-secret Defense Department documents exposing government policy in the unpopular Vietnam War, Mr. Goodale, then the young chief counsel at the Times, led its legal team through that challenge that it faced. His recently published book, Fighting for the Press, The Inside Story of the Pentagon Papers and Other Battles, takes the reader through the behind-the-scenes story of that well-known episode of our American history, applying its lessons to the more recent Bush and Obama administrations. Mr. Goodale is a graduate of Yale University and the University of Chicago Law School. He has taught at the Yale, NYU, and Fordham Law Schools and has been in the middle of many of the transformational media transactions and public policy debates regarding the media over the past 5 decades. The City Club is famously known as the Citadel of Free Speech, so it is my particular pleasure and privilege today to introduce to you a guardian of that free speech, James C. Goodale.
Thank you very much, Hewitt. As you probably know, Clevelanders, that Hewitt's firm, Baker & Hostetler, has been in the trenches fighting for the First Amendment even before I was born, and that was a long time ago. I'm particularly pleased to be here for several reasons. First, I've always think of Cleveland as my second hometown because my mother's father and mother grew up here as part of a huge family that owned a steel company that subsequently became part of Bethlehem Steel when Cyrus Eaton was active in Cleveland. That was a long time ago. Before I came out, I took a look at my genealogical records, and you won't believe this, but it's true. From that large family, I have 146 second cousins, and I virtually know some of them, but only virtually, because I've met them more or less for the first time on the net. And then that is part of today's story also. I'm thankful for being here, as Hewitt said, because this is the citadel of the First Amendment, and it gives me a chance to say things that I'm not sure everyone's going to agree with me about, but that's why I'm here under the aegis of the First Amendment. Give me a fair chance. Okay, now the title of this talk is Beware. Beware of governments that say you can't communicate or you can't publish classified information because it would damage national security. more often than not, that turns out not to be true. And beware, secondly, of President Obama. He is not exactly the best national security First Amendment president we've had. For reasons I will tell you, I think he's bringing up the rear. Now let's go to the first point. Beware about classified information, and talk about the Pentagon Papers and refresh your recollection what that was all about. The Pentagon Papers was a study that had been written by Leslie Gelb, a PhD from Harvard, detailing the history of the Vietnam relationship, really, and the Vietnam War in particular, starting in 1948 and going through to 1967. It started with the Geneva Accords of 1948 and went through all the process of subsequent events that took the United States through 1967. The study was given to the Rand Corporation, a consultant to the United States government, where Daniel Ellsberg was employed. When Ellsberg saw it, he was very excited, and he wanted to leak it. He gave it to several senators who said they couldn't leak that sort of information. It was classified, so he gave it to a New York Times reporter, Neil Sheehan. Actually, he laid it out on a bed in an apartment in Cambridge, Mass., and told Neil Sheehan he could look at it. He didn't say he could copy it. Neil Sheehan copied it anyway, so in a sense, Neil Sheehan stole the Pentagon Papers from Daniel Ellsberg. He gave them to the New York Times, so to speak, the entity, because he was a New York Times reporter. And the Times decided to publish excerpts of the Pentagon Papers. Why? What the Pentagon Papers showed, you know, we're now talking about 2 million words, 700,000 pages, tons and tons of stuff. But if you want to distill what it was all about from the New York Times point of view, is that it showed the lies that the American public had been told about the Vietnam War. First of all, it was told that Geneva Accords were broken by the North Vietnamese. They weren't. They provided for free elections. The United States did not let those elections go forward. It lied about the origins of the war, the Tonkin Gulf incident, in which the United States actually instigated an attack by the North Vietnamese on American ships, and it showed the lies that Johnson made when he ran for president in 1964. Johnson said he would not bomb North Vietnam in the campaign. He had the plans right there to do so, but he refused to tell the American public. What happened to this study was it was published and all hell broke loose. The United States came in and adjoined the New York Times on June 15th, and shortly thereafter it adjoined the Boston Globe and other papers. The case went to the Supreme Court after first the New York Times lost. New York Times lost the case in New York when it went up on appeal. People have sort of forgotten that. And the Washington Post won. When it reached the Supreme Court, of course, it came down with a famous decision, the Pentagon Papers case. That's why I'm here. In my book, Fighting for the Press, if you've forgotten, I say this is a great case. It will never be overturned. It's reached the level of Dred Scott or Roe versus Wade. It's part of our American history. Now, then, as was noted earlier, I was a lot younger than I am today, and I was asked to advise the New York Times whether the material could be published. I looked at the law and found there was very little. In fact, there never has been any law passed in this country that says you can't leak. There's the Espionage Act, but it's for espionage. And that's when you give material directly to the other side. But when you give it to the press, that's not espionage. So I advised the Times preliminarily that it could publish under the First Amendment. I couldn't see any clear and present danger for, as a result of such publication. Then the matter was taken out of my hands. And the Times talked to the former Attorney General of the United States, Herbert Brownell, talked to the city bar president of the city of New York, Louis Loeb, and they told him it was a crime to publish. And it was a crime even to look at the material. Well, I thought that that was the end of the matter, but later on I was asked yet a second time to advise. And now I thought everyone was talking to the outside lawyers, and it was all coordinated, and I was just part of the team. And I said, "Show me what you got." I read it again, came to the same opinion. Go ahead and publish. They published. You heard what happened. So the day before we had to be in court, I called up Herbert Brownell, and I said, Herb, I was a little young to say Herb, but I said, "Herb, I want to see you in court tomorrow defending the New York Times." He says, "I can't. I'm resigning." I said, "Why are you resigning?" So when I was Attorney General, I passed a regulation that permitted people to stamp documents, classified, top classified. So it was 11 o'clock at night. We were due in court in 8 hours. And if you think I'm going to tell you the rest of the story, you will never read my book. Suffice it to say, we won. Now, what most people don't realize is, while I know a lot about the Pentagon Papers, they really don't know what the Pentagon Papers were about. I'll bet you there isn't anyone out there that can tell me what it was the United States thought was so terrible that it couldn't be published and had to be enjoined. And indeed, the American public never knew at the time the case started what the information was about which the government was complaining. Why? Because it was all classified, and it was all presented in secret hearings. And when it wasn't presented in secret hearings, it was presented in briefs, secret briefs. Now, in the middle of my book, Fighting for the Press, you'll see, there's a great picture, I think. You can understand why, of me walking down the Supreme Court steps with a briefcase. Inside the briefcase are all the secret briefs that were served on the New York Times. And I walked right out of the Supreme Court with them, took them back to my desk, and then I laid them aside because Nixon decided he wanted to indict the New York Times. And that took some of my attention. About 6 weeks later, the government came in and said, "Can we have them back?" And I said, "Okay, but if we get indicted, I want them back." And the government didn't indict us, and I forgot about them. So here we are, 40 years later, I decided I wanted them back so I could write my book. Guess what? They're lost. Do you really think they're lost? No, I think they're probably deep sixth at the time of Watergate. That's my theory. So anyway, what I had to do was I had to put together from some of the participants who are still alive who remember what the government complained about, and pieces that I had that subsequently were disclosed, information that came out of Freedom of Information Act actions, and I made up my own list. And in my book you'll see the list of which the government complained. I think it's reasonably complete, but it may not, but it's better than anyone else has done before. Now, what was on that list, for example? What was on that list, for example, was you can't publish a diplomatic telegram from the then ambassador of Russia, Llewellyn Thompson, because that will disclose to the Russians what Thompson thinks of the Russians. Well, is that so terribly significant? Secondly, there were what I would call national intelligence estimates of the strength of Russia, China, North Vietnam. They're all 3 years old. More important, but didn't rise to a level of huge importance. And lastly, there are complaints that the United States had broken the North Vietnamese code by publishing one message from North Vietnam which appeared in what we would call decoded form. And that was given by the Solicitor General of the United States, unbeknownst to us, at the last minute to the Supreme Court, and said, stop publication because you're going to let the American people, more importantly, the North Vietnamese, know the code has been broken. But what the Solicitor General did not tell the Supreme Court was that telegram had already been published by the Foreign Relations Committee of the United States Senate. Well, this is a précis of what's in my book, but what's the bottom line? Beware. When all is said and done, and you look at the material of which the government has complained in a situation like this, and I would suggest in other situations, it's all hot air. The Pentagon Papers case was all a hot air. It should never have been brought. The only reason it was brought, I argue in the book, was that Nixon wanted to destroy the New York Times. All right, now let's move on to the second part of what I want to talk about, Obama. I want to say very clearly I'm a huge Obama supporter. I think he's a terrific president, but I give him an F for dealing with the press. When he first came into office, he told a court on the West Coast that he did not want disclosure of the torture experiences the United States went through during the post-terrorist era. And he wanted it kept secret because it was a state secret. However, when he ran for president, he took the opposite view. Secondly, he deep-sixed, excuse me for using that word again, a reporter's privilege law, a law that would, as Hewitt says, protect reporters from disclosing sources under a variety of situations by making a national security exception that gobbled up the law. Thirdly, he's continued to pursue a New York Times reporter, James Risen, who has not disclosed a source in a book he wrote covering Iran nuclear activities. And I think Mr. Risen stands a very good chance of going to jail. More to the point, if you could have more to the point, he has indicted and convicted 6 leakers. Now, in the history of the United States, there have only been 3 such convictions ever. And Obama, in a short period of time, has doubled that in a very short period of time. And one of those convictions was in the paper recently. It was, again, disclosure by a gentleman whose name is Kiriakou, who had disclosed the torture activities of the CIA. More to the point about what I'm talking here, that is national security, he has also indicted Private Manning, who leaked to WikiLeaks the cables and so forth and so on that became part of the huge WikiLeaks leak 2 or 3 years ago. He is pursuing Private Manning under a very peculiar theory of aiding the enemy, which has never been used in these type of cases, and that's not a good thing. So, lastly, I want to point out he's pursuing Assange. Okay, now who was Assange? Assange is an Australian who had his own website, and he called it WikiLeaks. Wiki because you're supposed to participate in the leak. If you want, you can change it, and all done on an anonymous basis. The big leak that brought Assange to attention was in 2010 when Private Manning, about which I've just spoken, leaked to him cables, information about Iraq, and what is known as the Afghan war logs. The material was attacked, the release was attacked immediately by Senator Lieberman and others as causing great damage to national security. Whether that's so or not, I rather doubt. The information about Iraq dealt with the amount of civilian casualties they had. For example, the information about the diplomatic cables was subsequently characterized by the Secretary of Defense as not being that important. The war logs are a different matter because there was a claim that they would disclose sources, and those African sources, and that they would be at risk of losing their lives. But I want to point out, as dangerous perhaps as that disclosure was, there has been no information whatsoever that any of those logs has caused injury to anybody. Now, what has happened as a consequence of that leak? First of all, Manning is subject to this trial. And this trial will be the greatest national security trial we've ever had in the history of this country. And it will begin in 5 weeks. Watch it. It's going to be very important from my point of view. Secondly, he has pursued Julian Assange. Now, what Assange did was that he took the material that he received from Manning, and before he did anything with it, he gave it to El Pais, a Spanish paper, he gave it to The Guardian, and he gave it to Le Monde. And when that information was delivered, The Guardian then shared it with the New York Times. And what happened was that all that material was published at the same time by the 3 publishers of which I've spoken. Now, the publication took place over several weeks and different times, but I'm mushing it all together for ease of conversation. The publication was that I've just described, which, by the way, was not only in the newspaper, but was on the websites of the New York Times and others. That publication was then followed by publication by Mr. Assange on his website. So now the question comes, who's who and who's what in the digital age? Who's a publisher? Who's a journalist? Who gets the protection, generally speaking, that we saw the New York Times got protection for in its publication of the Pentagon Papers, and who doesn't? The established press has said that they really can't see how Assange is, in fact, a journalist. Well, let's put that aside, because it's not as easy to see as what I'm about to say next. There's no question in my mind he's a publisher. In other words, when we all have email. We may not all have websites, but we're certainly familiar with websites. Websites publish material. Therefore, he, she who publishes material on a website has got to be a publisher, right? Well, if you don't agree, think about this. The New York Times publishes the same material, first in the paper, and then on its website. Now, same material. Has the New York Times published the material on its website? Is it a publisher? Seems to me the answer to that has to be yes. Now, if it follows that the New York Times is a publisher, it must be that he or she who does what the New York Times does must be a publisher too. And therefore, WikiLeaks is a publisher. Now, why do I care about all this? Because of the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects publishers. And if we don't have a First Amendment that protects publishers, publishers won't be able to publish what they want, and I won't be able to stand up here and say what I want. The government has decided that it wants to pursue Julian Assange this way. In December 2010, the Justice Department convened a grand jury to indict Julian Assange. It got a lot of publicity in 2010 and early 2011, and people have forgotten about it. But that grand jury, I'm here to tell you, is still alive as far as I'm able to determine. The government will not answer questions, particularly about it, but in the last 6 months, it has twice gone into court and said the grand jury is still alive. There were leaked Australian cables in December, which indicated its view, Australians' view, that the United States was going forward with this prosecution. Well, what's bad about that? In the Pentagon Papers case, there was an injunction against the New York Times. Remember I said that the New York Times was stopped? It was a censorship type of case. Thereafter, the government pursued the New York Times and tried to indict it, but didn't. So we have injunction and we have criminal process. Now, what do we have with Assange? We have the criminal process. No publisher has ever been indicted in the history of this country for publishing material criminally. It just never happens. But this is what the government wants to do to Assange, and it's not, and it doesn't end there. The government has concluded that it wants to pursue Assange in what's known as a conspiracy theory. We have Manny over here. Let's assume he violates the law. And then we have Assange over here, and the government says Assange doesn't have to have violated the law. All it has to do is agree with Manning to violate the law. May seem like a not important legal distinction, but if you're a reporter, it makes a lot of difference, because it means every time you go to someone who's got classified information and you were to say, hey, can you give me a little? Can you give me a little? You are participating in what the person is who has the classified information in the leak. If we assume for a moment we want to go after some leakers, but that has changed the equation because it now means we're going to go after leakees. Another way of saying this is that it criminalizes the news gathering process. This Committee to Protect Journalists, which is a freedom of speech organization in New York City, 2 years ago wrote to President Obama and said, please don't prosecute Assange under this theory, because it'll be the end of the type of reporting that people do when they are publishing and getting classified information. And by the way, I haven't talked about this much, but I assume you know that everything's classified. Everything's classified in the United States government. The amount of documents that Obama classified in his first year in office, 10 million. So this stuff is going to leak. Read Bob Woodward's books, Obama's Wars. I say in my book, 85% classified information. So what is the bottom line on all of this with respect to Julian Assange? Beware when someone is trying to pursue he who has published classified information, namely Obama. Beware also when that person has a bad scorecard for the 6 things I told you about that he's done that are anti-press. And why beware? Because inevitably it seems that he who pursues leakers for publishing classified information ends up doing nothing more than creating a lot of hot air. Thank you.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are listening to a Friday forum featuring James Goodale, leading First Amendment lawyer and author of Fighting for the Press, the Inside Story of the Pentagon Papers and Other Battles. We will return to our speaker momentarily for the traditional City Club questions. Please formulate your questions now and remember to be brief and to the point. We welcome all of you here today and those listening to 90.3 WCPN Idea Stream, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Our television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are our Development Associate Michael Cromaldi and Program Director Carrie Miller. May we have the first question, please?
Given that the law says that someone with a security clearance is breaking the law if he releases some of that secret or confidential material, and, you know, the conspiracy theory that comes out of that, should it not be illegal for the person who stamped secret on something to do it improperly? Would it help, would it be useful for it to be against the law for someone to categorize something as confidential or secret if it shouldn't be? Not setting aside the fact that it may be unenforceable, at least at the outset.
Well, isn't that a wonderful question? Because that would mean, you know, a lot of people would be spending a lot of time thinking about what they're doing before they do it, which was the purpose of the question. Now, there are lots of my book I didn't tell you about, but I didn't tell you about that I used to stamp documents exactly like that. And what led me to the place I'm here today is that I started worrying about it when I was in my 20s. But the fact of the matter is it's a rote process. I think the suggestion that everyone might be breaking the law if they misclassify is a draconian view of the law, but certainly I accept the suggestion that there ought to be some process that would make people stop before they stamp.
I found it interesting that you indicated that anybody who puts anything in the web or who sends an email out, who makes a movie, presumably is a publisher and should be entitled to the protection of the First Amendment. In thinking about it further, what that would mean is, for example, in the Citizens United case, there was a big question about should corporations be entitled to free speech, and that sort of becomes a non-existent question anymore because almost everybody is a publisher and thus entitled to the right of free speech. Would you agree with that, that therefore all corporations and nonprofit corporations should be entitled to free speech, which was, I guess, still is a big issue that is facing the Supreme Court?
The question is, if everyone out there is a publisher, everyone in this room who probably, because you all use email and you all post or whatever, how about corporations? And the reason that the question is raised is only known to the questioner, but it is a question one gets who stands in the shoes I am standing. Are you in favor of the First Amendment for corporations, which means are you in favor of Citizens United? And here's my answer. I hate Citizens United. I think that the ability to give money however you wish, if you're a corporation, load up the politicians with money is just terrible. From a First Amendment point of view, I have to say, as lawyers talk about principled, as a principled matter, that's when they think hard about it and try to make the principles line up. I think that corporations probably are entitled to free speech. I wish that the lawyers who brought the case, some of them who are friends of mine, because they thought as a principled matter the First Amendment applies, just had not brought the case.
Mr. Goodale, you mentioned in your talk today that the purpose that President Nixon had in bringing in the litigation involving the Pentagon Papers was basically to destroy the New York Times. Of course, the New York Times is publishing and doing pretty well, apparently. But I'd be interested in what your comments would be from your knowledge of the newspaper industry and related industries as to what effect that very expensive litigation had in restricting the media, newspapers and others, from similar publications that they might otherwise be using.
Well, as I understand the question is what has been the impact of that case on other publishers. I would think that it's been terrific. It's been very, very benign. It has established, as I argue in my book, a principle that one is not supposed to stray from, and since that has been established, it gives the press, no matter where it's located, including on the net, a sense of freedom that maybe it didn't have before the case. In fact, I would say this even further. Because of the speed of publication today on the net, and things happen so quickly, and because of the precedent of the Pentagon Papers case, I think one might be able to say the actions that the Nixon administration took against the Times and the Washington Post, and also the Boston Globe, by the way, are probably not going to be repeated for those two reasons. So where the real action is, as lawyers would say, or as members of the public, what should you look for? I think is probably more useful if you focus on actions such as the one that's been threatened against Assange, where he may be indicted for publishing. So, as I said a little bit in the talk, it's moved because of technology from what happened in the Pentagon Papers to what's happened after publication.
Mr. Goodale, you've made reference to abuses that you feel have been conducted by President Obama and his administration. He was a former constitutional law professor. I assume he has respect for the First Amendment. What do you assign to be his motivation? Why is this occurring? And are there others in the administration, perhaps other than the Attorney General, who you see as bringing about these abuses?
Well, when I have said this to people that I know, my book is just getting out, I find that, first of all, people look at me, are you really sure why? I try to answer the why question in the book, and I have to tell you, I don't think I've got a theory, but I don't think there's any clear answer. My answer would be Obama is a national security hawk. And I think that's benefited us in many ways, because he took all the risk of trying to kill bin Laden and succeeded. And I think he should be complimented for that. But every project that he looks at is from the national security hawk vision. And that also applies to drones. I think there's a comparison between drones and where he's coming out on the First Amendment. He's putting national security first. He's what First Amendment lawyers call, he's overbroad. He's doing too much. He ought to dial it back a lot. Now, why has he become a national security hawk, I suppose you would ask then. And if you are cynical, you would say, no Democrat president has been one for some time, if ever. It's not going to hurt him. Not going to hurt him politically. And then I think my second theory is that there's an interesting chapter in the book, Woodward's book, Obama's Wars, in which Obama is given a secret national security briefing. Question, why is that all in that book? I mean, there's nothing more damaging national security than a national security briefing to the president. Anyway, putting that aside, he came out of it and he said, I've inherited a world that's about to blow up in every possible manner, which said to me, before I had access to all the information I now have access, so I had one view, but now I know really how bad it is, I'm going to rethink, and I think he's rethought it as a hawk.
So far we've been commenting mostly on print media. How do you apply your thoughts to the war going on between syndicated television and syndicated talk radio on the other side, telling them what's been overblown?
Well, tell me what you mean by the fight.
Well, most people figure that everything that's on syndicated television is just slanted one way, and everything that's on the radio, about 90% of it, is criticism.
Well, you know, I don't like talk radio. I mean, right-wing talk radio. I don't. And by the way, I don't like left-wing nightly television. There's just too much screaming. I don't like Fox News that much, though I watch it. I think it's a brilliantly produced. I love what Fox News, parts of it. It's just so brilliantly produced. But it's tilted, and I keep asking myself, there was a time way back when all this took place in the 1970s, when we didn't have all of the above. We had more of a homogeneous, can I call it press, homogeneous media. I mean, there weren't any fringe groups that were causing a lot of excitement and attention. And so I said to myself, well, why are you worried about that? That's what the First Amendment is all about. But if you want to ask me whether I like it, I don't.
I have a question about, I know that you have gone before the Supreme Court multiple times, and do you think that that was a very positive or negative experience on your career and on your life?
Oh, hell. I mean, that was sort of biggest day in my life, right? Of course, I didn't tell you the exciting part of how this all turned out. But look, for someone any age, particularly my age, to, first of all, think of this. Went to the Supreme Court in and out in 17 days. Now, most lawyers sit at their desk and they work on things for years and years and years before they ever come to fruition. And all of a sudden, here's old little me, all of a sudden in the Supreme Court in a very short period of time, and not just any old case. So I thank President Nixon for bringing this case. It focused on what has actually been a lifelong interest ever since I've been a kid. I mean, this case was made for me and anyone who's interested in politics, history, and press, and there are all sorts of people who fit that. I mean, this is just the most exciting thing that could have ever happened, and it had happened so quickly. Great input on my career, to answer your question.
Mr. Goodale, had the Pentagon Papers case come before our current U.S. Supreme Court, would we have had a different result?
Well, the court back then was clearly a liberal court, six liberals and 3 conservatives, including, of the 3, Justice Blackmun, Roe versus Wade Blackmun. He was then known as a Minnesota twin because he was from Minnesota, as was the Chief Justice, Mr. Berger, and the 2 voted just like that, 6-3. And today, one could argue there is a conservative majority, but in cases like this, Justice Kennedy, he's the most important person on the Supreme Court probably in close cases because while he's conservative, he's frequently the 5th vote either way. So I think you have to ask yourself the question, if the case went to the court, what would Justice Kennedy do? Justice Kennedy is a pretty darn good First Amendment justice, by the way. I think he's better than many who are on the liberal, some who are on the liberal side. I think he's better than Justice Breyer, though, in the hypothetical you posted. Breyer would vote, and the 3 others of similar ilk. I think Kennedy would vote the same way, to answer your question. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
Obviously, the Internet has brought us into a whole new area, gray area involving free speech. I'm thinking of the case where the young man at Rutgers who was gay killed himself, in part perhaps because his roommate published or didn't publish stuff on Facebook about it. Where's the First Amendment in that case?
Yeah, I think that, you know, you remember how that case went. The roommate was gay and the other one was not, and the one who was not had a secret camera effectively, and the roommate who was gay and captured all of that and posted it. And there are other comparable examples of what one would call an invasion of privacy. And the question is, where do you come out on the First Amendment? Let me say first, I don't like that sort of stuff. And I think that the loss of privacy that we're all tolerating, which has been brought upon us, can I say, by the younger generation who don't feel about privacy the same as I do. I shouldn't say we do. Same as I do, is I want to say outrageous, but I'll say outrageous. But from a First Amendment point of view, the First Amendment is probably going to protect publication of matters that we have thought to have been private and no one would have ever published if they ever thought about it. You have to ask, is it speech? Yes, it's speech. Do you like it? No, I don't like it. Does it make any difference if you like it or not? So a little bit, your question is a little bit like the earlier one I got on Citizens United. I think the First Amendment protects it, but I don't like it.
I was wondering, what do you advocate regarding balance between national security and protection for press sources? Do you feel that there is a risk in national security by giving complete protection to all sources? Is there any sort of an issue there?
Well, I think this is an important question, and I don't want everyone to go away thinking that I'm a First Amendment voluptuary, that no matter what is published, it's good, and no matter how much national security is published, it's good. My position on this is that if the government has got it, it should keep it. But it's the job of the press to get it. And so the decision becomes in large part those who have access to national security information. In my own case, as I said earlier, I had such access. I wrote 3 or 4 reports, again, in my book, very much like the Pentagon Papers case. They're trivial. I wouldn't think of telling anybody about them. That's my own personal point of view. But how can it be, is the implication of the question, that you can, after what you just said, support the First Amendment with respect to publication of items you wouldn't personally leak? And I think it's because our system is anomalous. We can't make a parallel system out of the retention of classified information and the publication of classified information. The latter is governed by a standard that's entirely different than the standard that applies to the former. The latter standard is governed by the First Amendment. The former standard, all the details of which have not all been worked out, and that's what's so interesting about the Manning case, has a different and probably tighter standard. It's not to say that there aren't parts of the private Manning case that Obama shouldn't be going forward with. He ought to dial that back too. But it doesn't mean also, whatever standard you had over here for private Manning applies to the New York Times. That's the way the system works. It's a tough ethical question, but that's how I've worked it out.
Mr. Goodale, these debates that you've described largely take place hypothetically. Do you know of any instance where there was a disclosure, somewhere in this gray area where perhaps it's justified as a national security protected secret, or perhaps once found out it should be shared. Do we have any piece of history which really looks at a disclosure and says there's harm that flowed from that might help guide our choices?
You know, I'm glad you asked that question. It's the question I asked myself in this book when I finished making a judgment with respect to the material that was published. You're not asking about that. You're saying anywhere in history. And I started to think. And a few weeks ago, I had lunch with the greatest code breaker of all time, who has written a book called The Code Breakers. He's been at it as long as I asked him that question. And he's, oh, well, that's interesting. You would have thought he would have thought about it before, but this is what he's been doing for 50 years. No. I said, wait a minute. 50 years you can't find one such instance? No. So my answer to your question is, I haven't either. But I can't believe there isn't something out there. Now, why hasn't anyone found it? Because as with the information I told you that I found in my briefcase and recreated and so forth and so on, when you look at that in the light of history, there is no way you can say, in fact, that disclosure damaged national security. There just isn't any literature on it. So I've reasoned back from that and agreed with my friend who wrote The Codebreaker. I'm really beginning to wonder if there's anywhere, ever. You might think that's an extravagant statement, and I just said I wonder. But it is something to think about. Most of claims of national security are prospective. If you speak about this, if you publish about that, such and such will happen. And then someone makes a judgment as to the probability of that happening. Either the entity that's governing the person who's leaked, or perhaps the courts in the case of the New York Times and the Pentagon Papers case. But it's prospective. And I've never seen anybody to go back and look and see, did in fact all those horrible things happen? Except in my book, because that's what I say in my book. But I don't cover all of human history, or United States history.
I can't wait to read your book. I was wondering if you could speak to the absence of a federal shield law. I recently met Josh Wolf, who served 226 days in a federal prison in California in 2005, as you're probably well aware, for refusing to turn over videotapes to federal investigators. There is no federal shield law. There's a great shield law in California that doesn't protect you if the feds come looking for you.
Okay, so I referred to that briefly when I talked about Obama in the talk. What is a federal shield law? That's a law that says if you have a source and somebody wants it, generally speaking, you keep it. You don't turn it over. I've been called the father of the reporter's privilege for reasons that are really not totally appropriate. And I will tell you that why I described it the way I did, there are always exceptions in which you can do it. And what has happened, as in the case that was just described, you get into an exception, and then the reporter either has to go to jail or turn it over. So the press and others got together when Obama was senator and dreamed up this federal reporter's privilege law. Obama voted for it. It passed the House with like 15 nays. But when Obama came into power, what did he do? He took that very same law that he had proposed, and he stuck into it a national security exception. That's not what we were just talking about over there, but the national security exception meant anytime there's a national security case, you got to fuck it over. Well, those are the most difficult cases, so why would you have a bill that articulates the exception and kills the whole idea? Again, no one can figure it out. So the answer to your question is, after that experience where Obama had supported it, the House supported it, but then Obama ruined it, and then it died in the Senate and the House, I do not think there's going to be a federal reporter's privilege law in the near future.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we have been listening to a Friday forum featuring James Goodale, leading First Amendment lawyer and author of Fighting for the Press, the inside story of the Pentagon Papers and other battles. Thank you, Mr. Goodale. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
PNC is proud to support the presentation of this City Club of Cleveland Friday Forum on WVIZ PBS.
Additional support comes from Cleveland State University. Support for closed caption transcripts of City Club forums is provided by the Nordson Corporation Foundation.